Okay, so in part two here, what we'll do is to examine the key turning point, the year of 1917 itself, with regard to how the World War One would turn in favor of the Allied powers, and then also begin to turn attention towards the contributions, the vital contributions that the imperial peripheries provided to the European powers, specifically France and England, and their overall success and winning the war itself. Afterward, we'll look at the Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference that is going to establish the framework for a post-war world, uh, in which you have really the laying out of a pretty stark dichotomy between, on the one hand, European powers, imperial powers that wanted to maintain their empires, and on the other hand, new voices, more nationalist oriented voices, coming from those imperial peripheries that wanted to govern themselves and to, as a uh, return on investment. They wanted to, have their own kind of autonomy recognized by the imperial powers themselves. That conflict, that disagreement, would be largely unsettled during the interwar periods, which we'll talk about as well, and then get us into that era of the 1920s and moving forward into the 1930s with the Great Depression and kind of setting up all of that for um, World War II. So last time we left off talking about, again, 1917, in which, with regard to matters on the high seas, the German Navy, specifically its fleet of submarines, was going to return to using a very controversial tactic known as unrestricted submarine warfare. The greatest asset that submarines had, especially during World War One, but also generally speaking, is stealth. And the As a result, many submarines wish to attack any enemy vessels on the high seas without any announcement of the fact that they were going to do so. They wanted to attack any sorts of shipping, whether it was belligerent ships, that is to say, warships, or civilian vessels, or kind of believed to be carrying munitions or troops, or even cargo ships themselves. The idea here was, in the mindset of the Germans, was to cut off virtually, if not all trade, as much trade, and cut off the supply routes, the transatlantic supply routes, that was feeding the war effort for their adversaries, Britain and France primarily. Uh, as the war ground on, it was really the realization of the German authorities that that was going to have to be um, uh, that pursuit of unrestricted submarine warfare, the cutting off of those supply routes, was the key to victory for the Central Powers. That there really was no other possible route to victory itself. Now, the Germans had pursued and engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare prior to 1917, but the United States saw this as a threat to their own interests. Whether they were attacking U.S. shipping, putting U.S. lives at risk on the high seas. And so, as a result, the United States really offered an ultimatum, saying, "Look, if you don't stop this practice, this tactic, then we will enter the war on the side of the Allies." So the Germans had abandoned that tactic, but again, coming to the realization that there was no alternative by 1917, the German Navy began to use this tactic once again. As a result, in April of 1917, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, um, declared war on Germany. Essentially, he gave an address before a joint session of Congress, and Congress was responsible for declaring war, which it did. Um, from the U.S. perspective, the United States really didn't have a very kind of robust standing army during this period of time in American history. The army really only numbered maybe a couple uh, tens of thousands of troops. That was nowhere near the quantity of manpower necessary for engaging in a large scale conflict like World War One. And so, as a result, this meant that the United States was really going to build its army, build its military engine force from scratch. So it needed time in order to train and equip the troops and to begin to move them, ferry them across the Atlantic to Europe. Another key factor that played into the mindset, the mentality of the United States going into war, but also kind of another key um, ingredient to 1917 serving as this uh, specific year as a turning point in the war was that of the Russian Revolution. Now, the Russian Revolution is actually two revolutions that occur in the same year of 1917. Oftentimes, these are the spring and the fall revolutions, in which you have the um, end of the Tsarist regime in the spring of that year and the end of the Romanov dynasty. Um, this helped to establish a provisional liberal government that was able to seize control from the autocratic czarist regime. But in a fateful decision, the provisional government here, this more kind of liberal institution, decided to keep Russia in the war, to continue to, you know, serve as a bulwark on the Eastern Front, which was strongly advised by the interests of Britain and France themselves. Uh, but by 1917, many Russians, rank and file Russians, wanted out of the war. And so, even despite its best efforts, the new regime, this provisional government, was not able to really kind of win over a great deal of support among the populace itself, which opened the door to more extreme measures to be taken, a new regime to begin to attract a greater following, which was the Communist Revolution taking place in October, November of that same year, 1917. This revolution would be led by none other than Vladimir Lenin, and he was much more responsive, and the communists overall were much more responsive to the people's calls for land, peace, and bread. And so, as a result, this means that the this new again communist regime was going to be more responsive. And one of the first acts that it achieved was to actually take Russia out of the war itself once it replaced the provisional government. The treaty that the Russians signed with the Central Powers was known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which took place or um, was ratified in March of 1918. And as a result of that agreement, this meant that Germany was going to be able to take all of its forces deployed against the Russians and move them back to the Western Front in an effort to try and see through the von Schlieffen plan to take out France, seize the capital of Paris, and thus try and win a swift victory and kind of bring about a swift peace that would be more favorable to Germany itself. Time was of the essence because it knew by this point that the United States was already beginning to deploy troops in France and also get them on the front lines of the Western Front. This effort on part of the Germans failed. The U.S. troops, arrived in time in order to help stop the German advance. And once that became kind of the new uh, reality, uh, this meant that um, the seemingly endless quantities of fresh troops really spelled the doom for Central Powers. Again, European powers, by and large, whether on the Triple Entente, the Allied side, or the Central Powers, they universally suffered enormous losses by 1918, and so as a result, Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire really couldn't contend with the arrival of a fresh new adversary. And so as a result, on the at the 11th hour, 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, an armistice between all of the powers involved in World War One was agreed to, and it thus brought about really the end of World War One itself. Now, that is kind of the macro view, the kind of large scale assessment of the turn of events. Now I want to turn attention to just how vital the contributions were from other parts within the empire of particularly France and Britain in seeing to their success at the end of World War One. So America's help was not the only help that France and England, in particular, were receiving during this period of time. France, for its part, made uh, very ample use of what were known as the Senegalese soldiers. These were black troops from French-held West Africa. Um, Nearly 200,000 of these troops served France throughout the war. 135,000 of them fought in Europe, including in key battles such as the Somme and Verdun, and some even paid with their lives. As many as 30,000 troops, Senegalese soldiers, were killed over the course of the war, honoring their commitment, in essence, to the French imperial authority. For England, it made ample use of, among others, its Indian troops, Indians from the subcontinent of India. Um, some 1 million troops served. 138,000 of those served in Europe. 62,000 Indians died, and another 67,000 were wounded. Uh, Indian troops that were fighting for the United Kingdom were deployed in campaigns such as the Gallipoli campaign, in which some 15,000 Indian troops were deployed alone. Of course, this was the British offensive against the Ottomans in particular. Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, worked with Arab factions in order to advocate for Arab nationalist ambitions. You can kind of see an image of Lawrence of Arabia here in the lower corner. Uh, I mention Lawrence in particular because he is going to be at the center of affairs between establishing kind of a dialogue between the British Empire and the local Arab tribal leaders in the region. Among others, the family of Saud, which would later become the kind of governing authority of the new state of Saudi Arabia itself. At the same time, Uh, the British Empire was also beginning to turn attention and advocate for um, the establishing of a Jewish quote national home unquote, which was spelled out in the document known as the Balfour Declaration. This was an effort for the British Empire to appeal to Zionist ambitions. Basically, Zionism is those in support of a Jewish state and the creation of a Jewish state. That idea had been percolating since as early as Theodore Herzl, dating back to the 19th century. I think I mentioned that in an earlier lecture. And over time, the kind of main area that was agreed upon for this state to come about would be that territory of what was ancient Israel. Um, this was also, in many respects, kind of a British acknowledgement of the unfortunate, to put it mildly, history of anti Semitism in Western European history, or European history more broadly. That there would always be a series of pogroms that were committed against Jewish communities across the continent. And as a result, this was kind of an effort on behalf of the Balfour Declaration and the British Empire as a whole to try and, um, in some cases, right that wrong. Again, also to serve as another potential ally in this, war of attrition that was increasingly the case in World War One. These two examples, kind of the support for Arab nationalism and the support for Zionism, obviously are going to kind of be somewhat contradictory. And this is going to be helped by the fact that they were fueling a sense of ambiguity and potential conflict in matters relating to the Middle East, and really a key debate that continues to fester in the Middle East today. It's not the sole factor for setting the stage for regional problems, but it is one of the leading factors, again, to put it mildly. So, in many respects, World War One serves as a microcosm for all of the key problems and conflicts that would determine and dictate the rest of the 20th century, and you could argue even into the 21st century. With regard to the actual peace treaty that was going to now have to be agreed to and ratified by the leading powers of the world, not only in Europe but also the United States as well. We'll turn attention now towards that Treaty of Versailles and its lasting effects. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 gets underway in the spring of 1919. Again, the armistice being agreed to in the fall of the previous year. Um, the Treaty of Versailles is named after the location in which the world convened in order to deliberate the terms of the peace agreement itself. You can see a collection of the plenary session, you might say, of world delegates taking their you know uh, places in the Hall of Mirrors here at the Palace of Versailles. I will be uploading a documentary, Impossible Peace, which will get into kind of some of the more details that I'm going to gloss over, and give you kind of a further appreciation of the aspects and dimensions of the treaty. The treaty is very sweeping in its efforts to bring about and kind of serve as a one-stop shop for addressing grievances and problems, the kind of large-scale grievances and problems. So documentary does a nice job of laying out the major components of the peace treaty: the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the dissolution of Germany's overseas empire in places like Africa and areas of China as well. Um, with regard to the latter, China, the territory that Germany was forced to abandon would be taken over by Japan. There's also attention given to the reparations. Again, very characteristic of treaties during this period of time, in which those vanquished powers would be responsible for flipping the bill for the victors. Again, the number often thrown around with regard to the amount of reparations that Germany would be required to pay would total some 33 billion US dollars. So it was a pretty staggering sum for that day and age, a crippling amount really for Germany itself. And it was one of the main reasons why the masses, the citizens of Germany, felt so betrayed and very uh, took poorly to the terms of the treaty because they were saddled with such large amounts of debt. Although the final payments weren't made until the 21st century, as late as 2010, it's estimated, according to a BBC article that I'll also kind of put on Blackboard for you, it's estimated that some 269 billion gold marks were paid in total over the over that period of time from uh, on and off from 1919, 1920 into 2010. Another key term of the or clause of the treaty was that of the war guilt clause, known as Article 231, um, which specifically placed the blame for World War One at the feet of Germany. This again was also another just unacceptable, you know, qualification or clause that the German public was not willing to tolerate. That the in 1914, virtually all of Europe was eager to go to war to really kind of stick it to their longtime adversaries, whoever that may be, to seek glory on the battlefield for kind of achieving national honor, individual honor, and uh, heroism for rank and file members of all the virtual states, really. Um, so, in many cases, Germans themselves really didn't see this as their, you know, sole responsibility for taking all the blame. That really Russia, or excuse me, Europe as a whole was eager to go to war. Um, Interestingly, it should be importantly noted that Germany was not a part of this peace process. They were not involved in the negotiations, the deliberations that took place. They were only uh, provided with an ultimatum that when they were brought before the plenary session here, it was not to deliberate and negotiate terms. It was to sit down and sign the document, sign the treaty, up or down. That they would either accept the terms of the treaty or they would not. And so in that respect, the German delegates, really had no recourse but to sign. Uh, you know, um, so which is an interesting and sometimes often overlooked aspect of the entire peace conference itself, is that Germany being the sole surviving state after World War One. Again, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire being carved up and no longer existing. This meant that Germany was the last adversary standing, and so it was the one that was seen as the culprit for what had happened. There's also the Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which is again brought up in this documentary, Impossible Peace. It does a good job of outlining Wilson's ideas and their reception at Versailles. Um, Among other things, this has an ideological kind of orientation to it, these 14 points. That Woodrow Wilson himself was an idealist. He was kind of a moralist. That one of the best expressions of this is within the 14 points, the aspect of self determination, that people of the world should be allowed to govern themselves, to determine their own destinies for themselves. Another aspect is that of freedom of the seas, to help prevent any type of unrestricted submarine warfare, that people should be able to allow to traverse the seas open and freely, to negotiate and pursue their own trade interests. That there should be open diplomacy, no more secret treaties, and kind of that would help foment suspicion. Um, there would also be the establishment of a League of Nations, kind of a world body, a permanent body that would, serve as a forum in which any potential conflicts between states of the world could be deliberated in public and resolved peaceably. And also, among other things, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points advocated for disarmament. That you know, uh, the atmosphere, the mentality of Europe was one in which it was gearing up for war. The idea among kind of idealists was that, if you're preparing for war, you're in essence conceding the inevitability of war itself. But if you disarm, then you are reducing the likelihood of any type of potential conflict. So, um, excuse me. There was also, interestingly, Wilson comes to the Paris Peace Conference with these 14 points, and he's hoping to really see it through intact. That is to say, that they wouldn't be compromised in any way, shape, or form. Well, um, the European powers had their own agendas. I mean, France and Britain, especially, wanted to, retain as much as possible the iron grip that they had on their imperial possessions. And so, as a result of things like self determination, in reality, for large portions of the world, this translated into what's called or actually manifested itself in what's called the mandate system, in which various imperial locations or colonial powers were classified into A, B, and C classifications, often determined largely by racial composition and connotation. And as a result of this, A, B, or C tier, um, this allowed imperial powers to retain virtually all of their overseas imperial possessions and territories, and even in some cases allowed them to expand with the carving up of places like the Middle East with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire itself. The idea here was that, and to summarize quickly, we're almost out of time for this half hour. Uh, those in the A tier were those that were most capable and on the cusp of becoming self-determined states, kind of actualized or independent states. Whereas those with a B or C classification still had in the eyes of these imperial powers, had a ways to go in order to successfully administer affairs of state on their own. And so this was, again, largely um, kind of embedded within this classification, which was rather arbitrary and completely determined by European powers or uh, Western states themselves, led to kind of a racialized aspect. I'm going to stop there. When I come back, I'll talk about the League of Nations and the interwar years and such. All right, I'll see you in a bit.